The first thing I regained was not my vision, but the sound. It was a rhythmic, piercing beep that echoed through the hollow chambers of my skull. That heart monitor was the only thing proving I was still part of the living world, even though every fiber of my being felt like it had been shredded and left to rot. I lay there trapped in the heavy medicinal fog of the recovery room, my body feeling like lead against the thin hospital sheets. My lower abdomen throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that reminded me of the void where my future used to be. I had lost the baby. The realization should have broken me right then and there, but before I could even draw a breath to sob, the voices started. I kept my eyes closed, feigning the deep unconsciousness of anesthesia, because the tone of the conversation near my bed was not one of grief. It was the sharp, jagged sound of calculation. I heard the heavy, rhythmic tapping of Ms. Gladys's expensive heels on the linoleum floor. Then came the voice of Terrell, my husband, the man I had once thought was my protector. He did not ask the nurse about my recovery. He did not mention the child we just lost. Instead, he hissed about the cost. He grumbled that this emergency surgery was going to set them back thousands of dollars. He complained that the private room was an unnecessary expense for someone who was just sleeping anyway. Hearing him talk about me like I was a faulty piece of equipment or a bad investment ignited a cold, hard spark inside my chest. My mind flashed back to the many nights I spent hunched over my glowing computer screen until 4 a.m. I remembered the burning in my eyes and the way my wrists cramped as I built complex security architectures for international banks. I did not do that for myself. I did it to pay off the $20,000 in gambling debts Terrell had accumulated behind my back. I did it because I believed that if I provided enough stability and enough grace, our family would finally heal. I thought a baby would be the glue that finally stuck his shattered character back together. I had been a fool to think that my hard work could buy his loyalty. As Miss Gladys whispered back to him, her voice was cold and devoid of any grandmotherly warmth. She told him that they needed to stop worrying about the hospital bill and start focusing on the exit strategy. She called me a liability. She said that now that the pregnancy was over, there was no longer any reason to pretend to care about a woman who spent more time with servers and firewalls than with her own family. They stood there, 2 vultures circling what they thought was a corpse, debating the price of my pain, while my heart monitor continued its lonely mechanical cry. I realized then that the man I loved was a ghost, and the woman standing next to him was the one who had conjured him. Hi everyone, I'm Ebony Justice Diaries. Welcome back to the channel. If you enjoyed today's content, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe. Also, turn on notifications so you're the first to know when my latest videos drop. The atmosphere in the room shifted from cold calculation to a frantic, desperate energy. I remained perfectly still, my breathing shallow and controlled, even as my soul screamed in protest. Ms. Gladys leaned in closer, her cloying floral perfume suffocating me as she spoke in a sharp whisper. She told Terrell that they did not have much time before the night nurse returned for the hourly rounds. She urged him to grab my hand, her voice dripping with a poisonous urgency that made my skin crawl. Terrell hesitated for only a second before I felt his clammy, trembling fingers wrap around my right wrist. He lifted my hand, which felt like a heavy, lifeless limb detached from my body. The physical violation of being handled like an object while I was trapped in the prison of my own skin was a spiritual agony far worse than the surgical pain in my womb. He fumbled with my phone, the plastic casing clicking against his wedding ring, a ring that I had paid for with my last Christmas bonus. I felt him press my thumb against the cool glass surface of the sensor. He had to do it twice because his hands were shaking so much from the adrenaline of his own betrayal. On the third attempt, the distinctive melodic chime of a successful login echoed through the quiet room. It was the sound of the application I called the Vault. They thought they had just opened the doors to my kingdom, but in reality, they had just stepped into a digital execution chamber. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from a dark, brewing satisfaction. They had no idea that the Vault was not a real banking application. I had spent 14 months developing that specific software for a federal task force as a honeypot to lure in high-level cybercriminals and money launderers. Every single dollar that was about to be moved through that interface was tracked by a dozen government servers in Virginia. The moment they initiated a transfer, they were not just stealing from their wife, they were engaging in federal wire fraud and identity theft on a grand scale. I heard Terrell gasp in delight as he saw the balance of $980,000, a figure I had programmed as bait for the greedy. He whispered to his mother that they were finally rich and that they would never have to look at my tired, working face ever again. As I heard the frantic tapping of his fingers executing the transfer, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. They were laughing in the dark, believing they had left me with nothing but hospital bills and a broken heart. They did not realize that they had just signed their own death warrants with their own fingerprints. They were celebrating a victory that was actually their downfall. I stayed silent, allowing them to relish their stolen treasure, because I knew that the higher they climbed on this pile of fake money, the harder they would hit the ground when the federal agents finally arrived to collect the debt. You have officially crossed the line, I thought to myself, and there is no coming back from the hell I have built for you. The morning sun bled through the thin hospital curtains, casting a cold, clinical light over the room. I felt every inch of the stitches in my abdomen as I tried to shift my weight. The door swung open with a sharp metallic click, but it was not the doctor with a discharge plan. It was a woman from the billing department, accompanied by a nurse who refused to meet my eyes. The billing administrator cleared her throat and looked down at her tablet. She informed me in a voice as flat as cardboard that my primary insurance had been terminated at midnight. She said that my husband, the primary policyholder, had called to report a life event that supposedly removed me from the coverage. My heart skipped a beat, but I remained silent. I handed her my personal emergency credit card, a card that had a $50,000 limit, the one I had used to pay for Terrell's car repairs and his mother's hip surgery. The administrator swiped the card. There was a brief, agonizing silence, followed by a sharp electronic rejection beep. She tried it again, her brow furrowing. She told me the card was declined for insufficient funds. I knew exactly what had happened. Terrell had not just emptied the digital trap I set he had spent the last few hours systematically stripping my real life to the bone. He had maximized every line of credit I had ever trusted him with. The nurse finally spoke up, her voice devoid of the compassion she had shown the night before. She told me that since I was now an uninsured self-pay patient with no valid form of payment, the hospital could no longer justify keeping me in a private recovery suite. She said they needed the bed for a paying patient, and that I had 30 minutes to vacate the premises. I struggled to sit up, a wave of nausea washing over me as the physical pain vied for attention with the cold fury in my soul. I asked for a wheelchair, but the billing woman pointed to a security guard standing in the hallway. This man was someone I recognized. His name was Officer Miller. I had given him $500 last Christmas because his daughter needed braces and the hospital union was on strike. I looked him in the eye, expecting a shred of human decency, but he looked through me like I was a smudge on the glass. He stepped into the room and told me that he had orders to escort me to the curb. He said that if I could not walk, he would have to physically assist me out of the building to prevent a loitering charge. The humiliation was a thick, bitter pill to swallow. I had spent years being the benefactor, the strong one, the woman who handled everyone else's crisis with a checkbook and a smile. Now, as I gripped the bed rail to keep from collapsing, these people treated me like a common criminal. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling like a newborn calf. Every step toward the door felt like a hot needle pressing into my spine. As I passed the nursing station, I heard the staff whispering about the fallen architect, who could even pay for her own surgery. I did not look back. I leaned against the cold walls of the corridor, dragging my body forward with nothing but pure, unadulterated spite to fuel my muscles. I was being tossed out like trash by the very institution I had donated thousands to during their annual fundraisers. Terrell had not just stolen my money, he had weaponized my own kindness against me, turning my reputation into a joke and my tragedy into an inconvenience for the hospital's bottom line. I reached into the small plastic bag containing my personal effects, my fingers trembling as they brushed against a small, cold object tucked into the very bottom. It was my grandmother's 24-karat gold wedding band. This was not just a piece of jewelry, it was a relic of survival from the Jim Crow era, a symbol of a woman who had picked cotton and scrubbed floors to ensure her children could dream of something better than a life of service. The gold was soft, worn down by decades of hard labor and prayer, but it carried a weight that no bank account could ever match. I looked at the administrator, whose eyes were still fixed on her tablet, with an expression of bored indifference. I placed the ring on the cold white counter between us. The metal made a soft, solid thud that seemed to silence the chaotic noise of the hospital hallway for a fleeting second. I told her that this ring was pure gold and that its value far exceeded the cost of a single night in this room. I watched as her eyes widened, the greed flickering just beneath her professional mask as she picked it up to examine the hallmark. As she walked away to consult with her supervisor about the collateral, I closed my eyes and leaned my forehead against the cool surface of the wall. In that moment of absolute isolation, I felt a warmth spread through my chest that did not come from the hospital heaters. I could almost hear my grandmother's voice, a deep and melodic hum that resonated in the marrow of my bones. She reminded me that our people had survived Middle Passages, plantations, and systemic cages designed to break the black spirit. She whispered that I came from a long line of women who knew how to make a way out of no way. The pain in my abdomen was still there, a sharp and biting reminder of my loss, but the spiritual vacuum was beginning to fill with a fierce and righteous fire. I realized that Terrell and Miss Gladys had only stolen what was on the surface. They had taken the paper, the plastic, and the digital numbers, but they could never touch the foundation. I stood up straighter, forcing the air into my lungs, even though it hurt to breathe. Black women do not simply fall down and stay there. We only descend into the shadows to prepare for a much larger and more devastating war. We are the architects of endurance. My grandmother had kept that ring through the leanest years of the Great Depression and the terrors of the segregated South, and now it was serving its final purpose as my bridge to freedom. The administrator returned her tone slightly more respectful now that she held a piece of my history in her hand. She told me they would accept the ring as a temporary deposit and that I had 24 hours to vacate the room before the next billing cycle began. I nodded, not because I was grateful, but because I was calculating my next move. The fog of anesthesia had completely evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity that only comes when you have nothing left to lose but your dignity. I was no longer just a victim of a husband's greed or a hospital's bureaucracy. I was a woman reclaiming her power. I took one last deep breath, feeling the strength of my ancestors fortifying my spine like a steel rod. Terrell thought he had left me in the dirt, but he forgot that I was a seed, and I was already beginning to grow through the cracks of his betrayal. The taxi dropped me off 2 houses away from my own driveway because my legs were still shaking, and I did not want the driver to see me collapse. I dragged my weary body toward the front door of the brownstone. I had spent 10 years paying for the house where I had planned to raise the child I just lost. When I reached the heavy oak door and slid my key into the brass lock, it refused to turn. I tried again, my heart pounding against my ribs, but the mechanism felt different, cold, and unresponsive. They had changed the locks. Before I could even process the shock, a shower of fabric and plastic exploded from the second-floor balcony. My silk blouses, my professional blazers, and my favorite pair of running shoes tumbled through the air like colorful wounded birds before hitting the wet pavement. I looked up and saw Quentin, my brother-in-law, leaning over the railing with a smirk that made my blood boil. Standing right next to him was Ms. Gladys, clutching a glass of expensive wine that I knew came from my private cellar. She did not look at me with pity or even anger. She looked at me with a terrifying, calculated triumph. Quentin shouted down to the street that I should take my trash and get lost, because this house no longer belonged to a woman who could not even keep a family together. He began tossing my books and my framed architectural awards into the gutter, laughing as the glass shattered on the concrete. The noise began to draw the attention of the neighbors' people I had shared Sunday barbecues with, who were now peering through their curtains and whispering behind their hands. The situation escalated from a domestic dispute to a public execution when Ms. Gladys pulled out her cell phone. She did not call Terrell, she called the police. I stood there clutching my stomach where the surgical stitches pulled painfully as she began to wail into the receiver. She told the dispatcher that a mentally unstable woman was trying to break into their home. She claimed that the trauma of the miscarriage had caused me to lose my mind and that I was now a dangerous intruder who was hallucinating about owning the property. She described me as a grieving hysteric who needed to be institutionalized for the safety of the neighborhood. Her voice was loud enough for every person on the block to hear, effectively stripping me of my sanity and my reputation in one fell swoop. I watched as my neighbors shook their heads, some of them pointing at me with expressions of misplaced sympathy that felt like slaps to the face. They did not see a successful security architect being robbed of her life. They saw the lie Ms. Gladys was selling a broken black woman who had finally snapped under the weight of her grief. I could hear the distant wail of sirens approaching from 2 blocks away. My own house had been turned into a fortress against me, and the very people I had supported were now using my deepest pain as a weapon to have me hauled away in handcuffs. I realized then that I could not win this battle with shouting or tears. I had to let them think they had won. I stood my ground for one more second, memorizing the look of pure malice on their faces before I slowly turned away to gather what little I could from the pile of debris in the street. I did not scream. I did not beg. I stood there in the middle of the sidewalk, a woman who had lost her child, her home, and her dignity in the span of 24 hours, and I simply began to breathe. The sirens were getting louder, screaming through the city streets like a predator closing in on its prey. I ignored the stinging pain in my surgical site and knelt down beside a discarded plastic bin. Among the heap of my ruined clothes and broken plates, I saw it. It was a battered silver laptop, an old machine I had used during my first year as a junior analyst. To Terrell and Quentin, it was a piece of electronic junk, a dinosaur that was not worth the effort of selling. To me, it was the most lethal weapon in the state of New York. I tucked the laptop under my arm and gathered a handful of loose papers before turning my back on the house that was no longer mine. I walked 3 blocks to a small, narrow diner nestled between a barber shop and a laundromat. The neon sign in the window flickered with a warm amber glow, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. This place was called Mama Lou Ellen's Kitchen. I had spent 4 years here during my university days, wiping tables and serving coffee until 2 o'clock in the morning to pay for my certifications. When I pushed the door open, the bell chimed with a familiar brassy ring. The air smelled of fried catfish collard greens and decades of shared secrets. Mama Lou Ellen, a woman whose face was a beautiful map of resilience and silver hair, looked up from the counter. She did not ask why I looked like I had crawled out of a wreckage. She saw the hospital wristband and the look in my eyes, and she simply pointed to a quiet booth in the far back corner. She brought me a tall glass of ice water and a plate of cornbread without saying a single word. I thanked her with a nod, my voice too fragile to trust with actual speech. I opened the laptop, the screen flickering to life with a low, mechanical hum that felt like a heartbeat. The hinges were loose and the battery was weak, but the internal wireless card was one I had modified myself years ago. It could bypass almost any standard commercial encryption. I looked around the diner, seeing the faces of my community, hard-working people who spent their lives building things that others tried to take away. I felt a surge of protective fury. I was not just fighting for my money anymore. I was fighting for every woman who had ever been told she was nothing without the man who was robbing her blind. Mama Lou Ellen walked over and leaned against the booth, her presence a solid, comforting weight in the dim light. She told me that I could stay as long as I needed to, even if I stayed until the sun came up. She said that the devil thinks he is busy, but the Lord is always working overtime. I felt a tear finally escape and track a path through the dust on my cheek. I wiped it away with the back of my hand and turned my focus to the keyboard. I logged into a secure encrypted tunnel that only a handful of people in the federal government even knew existed. I was about to turn this humble diner booth into a command center. Terrell and his mother were probably popping champagne corks in my living room, but they were about to find out that the woman they threw into the darkness was the one who controlled the lights. The screen of my battered laptop flickered with a ghostly blue light reflecting in my tired eyes as I sat in the dim corner of the diner. My fingers moved across the keys with a precision that felt like a surgeon performing a delicate procedure. I bypassed the standard security protocols and entered the back end of the application known as the Vault. The interface was clean and deceptive, showing a balance of $980,000 in a sleek gold font. It looked like a dream come true for a thief, but to me, it was a digital ledger of sins. I watched in real time as the first major transaction flashed across my screen. Terrell was at a luxury dealership on the north side of the city. He had just authorized a payment of $85,000 for a brand new Cadillac Escalade, the kind of vehicle that screamed status and arrogance. A cold smile touched my lips as I watched the federal servers in Virginia record the exact location, the timestamp, and the digital signature used for the purchase. Every time he swiped that virtual card, he was not just spending money, he was hammering another nail into his own coffin. But the Escalade was just the beginning. Less than 40 minutes later, another notification popped up. This time he was at a high-end jeweler downtown. The transaction was for $42,000 for a gold Rolex Submariner. I could almost see him standing there puffing out his chest and acting like a king, completely oblivious to the fact that the crown he was buying was made of federal wire fraud. The conflict inside me was a strange mix of grief for the baby I lost and a calculated icy rage toward the man who thought I was too weak to fight back. I knew that the current amount they had stolen was enough for a significant prison sentence, but I wanted more. I wanted to ensure that they would never see the light of day as free citizens for a very long time. I reached into the code of the honeypot and began to manipulate the parameters of the account. I deliberately unlocked an additional credit line of $500,000, labeling it as a pre-approved investment bonus. I wanted to feed their greed until it bloated and choked them. I was opening the gates of the reservoir, inviting them to drown in their own lack of character. As I watched them dive deeper into the fake wealth, I felt like a spider adjusting the silk of a massive invisible web. They were so blinded by the glitter of the luxury items that they failed to notice the suspicious lag in the authorization process or the unusual lack of identity verification. They thought they were being clever, thinking that my grief had made me careless with my passwords and security. They had no idea that I was the one holding the leash. Every Rolex, every designer suit, and every bottle of expensive champagne they bought was a recorded felony. I was not just watching a robbery, I was orchestrating a downfall. I leaned back against the worn vinyl of the booth, my surgical stitches pulling slightly, and watched as the total spent climbed toward $200,000. The mouse was not just eating the cheese, it was calling its friends to the feast, and I was more than happy to keep the trap wide open. The deeper I dug into the digital footprints of Quentin, the more I realized that his stupidity was only matched by his dangerous ambition. While Terrell was busy playing a rich man in the streets, Quentin was trying to become a kingpin in the shadows. Through the back door of the application, I watched a series of encrypted messages moving between Quentin and a third party. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the digital signature of a notorious local criminal organization that specialized in high-stakes money laundering. Quentin was not just spending the fake money, he was attempting to convert the $300,000 of digital credits into untraceable physical cash through a real-world criminal network. He was offering a 30% commission to these professional cleaners to wash what he thought was a legitimate fortune. This discovery shifted the stakes from a domestic betrayal to a lethal game of chess. Quentin was involving actual monsters in a scheme built on a foundation of smoke and mirrors. If those criminals found out that the money Quentin was providing was a federal bait, they would not go to the police, they would go for his throat. And if they traced the source of the application back to me, I would be the next target on their list. I leaned over my laptop, the flickering light making the shadows in the diner look like reaching hands. I had to maintain a delicate balance. I needed to let the federal servers record the transaction to secure the life sentences, but I also had to ensure that the physical meeting between Quentin and the cartel did not happen before the FBI was ready to move. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as a red alert flashed on my screen. Quentin had triggered a remote ping on my old phone, the one I had used to log into the system from the hospital. He was trying to locate me. In his arrogance, he wanted to make sure I was not somewhere talking to the authorities. The danger was immediate and visceral. If I stayed connected to the diner's public network for too long, his tracking software would pinpoint my exact coordinates within 20 feet. I had to work with surgical speed. I began writing a recursive script to bounce my IP address through 17 different servers across 3 continents. I was creating a digital hall of mirrors, making it look like I was in a basement in Seattle one second and a hotel in London the next. Every second I stayed online was a gamble with my life. I could feel the tension radiating from my spine, the surgical pain in my abdomen flare up with every sharp movement. I watched Quentin send a final message to the cleaners, setting a meeting time for the following evening. He was walking directly into a trap that was now much larger than he could ever imagine. I was not just a grieving woman in a diner anymore. I was a ghost in the machine, manipulating the movements of criminals and federal agents alike. I had to protect myself while ensuring the evidence was ironclad. I took a deep breath, my fingers flying across the keys to finalize the encryption. I was the architect of this chaos, and I had to remain invisible until the very moment the walls closed in on them. One wrong click and my location would be revealed to men who had no mercy for witnesses. I closed the laptop lid just as the tracking bar hit 90%, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sat in the sudden darkness of the booth. The invitation did not come to me through a formal card or a polite phone call. It came through the toxic filter of social media, where Ms. Gladys had posted a series of photographs showing off a sprawling mansion in the hills. They had used the stolen digital credits to secure a short-term lease on a 10,000-square-foot estate, and they were throwing a housewarming party to celebrate their new life of crime. I sat in my small booth at the diner, watching the live stream as Terrell popped a bottle of vintage champagne. They had invited every mutual friend we owned, every former colleague, and even our old neighbors. Between the loud music and the expensive catering, I could hear them spinning a web of lies. They were telling everyone that I had suffered a mental breakdown and that they were forced to distance themselves for their own safety. They were painting me as a bitter, broken woman while they stood on the pedestal of my stolen success. I stood up from the booth, my body still protesting with every movement. I went to a small boutique using the last bit of cash I had managed to secure before the accounts were frozen. I chose a long, elegant black dress made of heavy silk. It was a garment of mourning, but it was also a suit of armor. The fabric was thick enough to hide the medical bandages and the surgical stitches that still lined my lower abdomen. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I did not see a victim. I saw a reckoning. I spent an hour on my makeup, sharpening my features and masking the exhaustion under my eyes. I was not going to that party to plead for my house or to cry over my marriage. I was going there to act as the master of ceremonies for their destruction. I did not go to the mansion alone. Waiting for me in the parking lot of a nearby grocery store were 3 black sport utility vehicles. 6 men and women in plain, inconspicuous suits stood by the cars, their faces devoid of emotion. They were federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division, the very people I had been collaborating with to build the vault system. We had spent the last 4 hours finalizing the arrest warrants and mapping out the interior of the villa. These agents were my silent partners in this dance. They were not there for a party. They were there to serve as the iron hand of justice. One of the lead agents, a woman named Miller, checked the small microphone hidden beneath my collar. She told me that they would be right behind me listening to every word and that the moment I gave the signal, the celebration would be over. The drive to the hills was quiet and cold. As we approached the gated entrance, I could see the bright lights of the mansion reflecting off the polished hoods of the luxury cars lined up in the driveway. The sound of bass, heavy music thumping through the air felt like a challenge. Terrell and Ms. Gladys thought they had won because they had the keys to a temporary palace. They believed that because I was a woman of color who had lost her child and her husband in 1 week, I would simply fade into the background of my own tragedy. They underestimated the fact that I had built the very systems they were trying to exploit. As I stepped out of the vehicle and straightened my black dress, I felt a surge of cold, unwavering power. I was the architect of their current joy, and I was about to become the builder of their permanent cage. I walked toward the front door with the federal agents trailing at a distance, ready to turn their housewarming into a cold, hard homecoming for the truth. I stepped through the double mahogany doors of the mansion, the heavy scent of lilies and expensive perfume hitting me like a physical blow. The crystal chandelier above the grand foyer cast 1,000 jagged shards of light across the room. The music died down as I moved through the crowd, my black silk dress whispering against the marble floor. People whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting between my pale face and the glass of champagne in Ms. Gladys's hand. She was standing at the top of the grand staircase, draped in a gold-sequined gown that looked like it cost more than most people earn in a year. She looked down at me with a smirk of pure, unadulterated arrogance, her eyes glittering with the cold light of a predator who thinks the prey is already dead. She began to laugh, a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the high ceilings. She called me a pathetic loser and mocked me for showing up to a party I was clearly not invited to attend. She told the entire room that I was a woman who had lost everything because I was too weak to keep my own home together. I stood perfectly still, letting her venom wash over me, my hands folded calmly in front of me. I looked up at her and spoke in a voice that was soft, but carried to every corner of the foyer. I asked her how it felt to live in a house built on someone else's blood. I asked her if the wine tasted better knowing it was bought with a stolen thumbprint. Ms. Gladys cackled, leaning over the gilded railing to look me in the eye. She was so intoxicated by her own perceived power that she could not help but brag about her genius. She told the guests that I was the one who was truly stupid for sleeping so soundly in that hospital bed. She boasted about how easy it had been to take my hand and press my limp thumb against the cold glass of the phone. She laughed as she described the way Terrell's hands shook with excitement as they watched the numbers fly from my account into theirs. She called me a fool for thinking that my career and my security codes could protect me from a family that knew how to take what they wanted. She admitted to the entire room in front of 100 witnesses that they had planned the theft the moment the doctor told them I was losing the baby. I watched her face, recording every twitch of her lips and every glint of triumph in her eyes. I saw Terrell standing behind her, a smug grin on his face as he adjusted his new diamond cufflinks. They were so proud of their cruelty, so sure that I was a broken woman with no recourse. I thanked her for her honesty, my voice dripping with a lethal calm that finally made her smile falter. I told her that she had just provided the finest testimony a prosecutor could ever hope to hear. I reminded her that while she was playing a queen in a rented castle, I was still the architect of the vault. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating as the realization began to crawl up her spine like a cold insect. She had just handed me the final key to her own prison cell, and the look of dawning horror on her face was more satisfying than any amount of gold. I reached into my small black clutch and pressed a single button on a remote device that I had synchronized with the mansion's high-end entertainment system. The massive 80-inch television screen in the living room flickered to life, cutting through the celebratory music like a lightning bolt. The room fell into a deafening silence as the guests turned to see a crystal-clear recording of Ms. Gladys standing on the balcony just 10 minutes prior. Her voice boomed through the surround sound speakers, boasting about how she had manipulated my unconscious body and stolen my digital identity. Below the video, a scrolling ledger appeared, displaying every single fraudulent transaction they had made using the Vault application. It showed the $85,000 for the Cadillac and the $42,000 for the Rolex, all marked with bright red federal warning icons. The color drained from Terrell's face, turning his skin into a sickly shade of gray. Before he could even open his mouth to spin another lie, the heavy front doors were kicked open with a thunderous crash. 12 federal agents in tactical gear flooded the foyer, their weapons drawn and their voices commanding everyone to get on the ground. The screams of the panicked guests filled the air, but my eyes remained fixed on Terrell. He did not try to protect his mother or stand with any shred of dignity. Instead, he collapsed to his knees on the marble floor, his hands trembling as he reached out toward me. He began to sob, his voice a pathetic whine, as he started to blame Ms. Gladys for everything. He cried out that it was her idea to take the fingerprint and that he was just a victim of her greed. Ms. Gladys stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her gold sequins no longer glittering but looking like the scales of a trapped snake. She looked at her son with a mixture of shock and pure hatred as he continued to sell her out to the agents. While the chaos unfolded in the center of the room, Quentin tried to make a break for the back exit near the kitchen. He thought he could disappear into the darkness of the estate grounds, but he did not get more than 5 steps. 2 agents who had been waiting in the shadows tackled him to the ground, the sound of his face hitting the floor echoing through the room. They pulled his arms behind his back and snapped the steel handcuffs onto his wrists with a definitive metallic click. I stood in the center of the room, a black pillar of calm amidst the wreckage of their lives. I watched as an agent stepped forward and read Terrell his rights while he continued to beg for mercy that he had never shown me. They were being stripped of their borrowed luxury in front of every person they had tried to impress. The mansion that they thought was a symbol of their victory had become their cage. I felt no pity for them as the agents led them away in chains. They had stolen my money and mocked my grief, but they had forgotten that I was the one who built the labyrinth they were now lost in. As the red and blue lights of the police cruisers strobed against the windows, I knew that the debt was finally being paid in full. The flashing red and blue lights finally faded into the distance, leaving the massive estate in a heavy, echoing silence. I stood on the edge of the driveway watching as the federal agents placed the final yellow strips of crime scene tape across the mahogany doors. The mansion that was supposed to be the monument to my husband's greed was now just a hollow shell being reclaimed by the law. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my primary phone, the one I had kept hidden and encrypted. With a few steady strokes of my fingers, I navigated past the decoy accounts and the federal honeypots. I entered a biometric sequence that only I knew. Within seconds, my real assets appeared on the screen. The $450,000 in my private savings, the $2 million in my retirement portfolio, and the deed to my brownstone were all intact. I had built a fortress within a fortress, a secondary layer of security that Terrell's shallow mind could never have even imagined. I looked up at the moon, which hung like a silver coin over the dark silhouette of the trees. A cool evening breeze swept across the lawn, fluttering the hem of my black silk dress and carrying away the suffocating scent of the party's expensive lilies. For the first time since I woke up in that sterile hospital room, I drew a breath that did not feel like it was being squeezed out of my lungs by betrayal. The physical pain in my abdomen had settled into a dull, manageable thrum, a scar that would always remind me of what I lost, but no longer a wound that defined who I was. I had lost a child and a marriage, but in the fire of that destruction, I had forged a woman who was entirely unbreakable. I was no longer defined by the man I supported or the family that tried to consume me. I turned away from the sealed mansion and began to walk toward the gates. I did not need a luxury Cadillac or a gold Rolex to feel the weight of my own worth. My true wealth was never something that could be transferred through a thumbprint or stolen by a greedy mother-in-law. My wealth was my intellect, my resilience, and the cold, hard clarity that comes from surviving the unthinkable. I thought about my grandmother and the ring I had used to buy my way out of that hospital. I knew that tomorrow I would go back and reclaim that gold, returning it to its rightful place as a symbol of our endurance. Terrell and Ms. Gladys were starting their new lives in a world of concrete and steel, but I was stepping into a world of infinite possibility. As I reached the street, I felt a profound sense of peace settle into the marrow of my bones. I had not just recovered my money, I had reclaimed my soul from the vultures. I had proven that a woman of color with a sharp mind is the most dangerous architect in the world. I looked back one last time at the dark house on the hill and whispered a silent goodbye to the ghost of the life I thought I wanted. The path ahead was dark, but my eyes were wide open, and for the first time in 10 years, I was walking exactly where I wanted to go. I was the master of my own security, the builder of my own future, and finally, I was free. Through this journey, I learned that your worth is not measured by the people who fail to value you, but by the strength you find when you are standing alone. Pain is often a forge turning your softest parts into unbreakable steel. Never mistake a woman's silence for weakness or her kindness for stupidity. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't a loud shout, but a silent, strategic success. Trust your instincts, protect your peace, and remember that when God closes a door of betrayal, He is preparing a grand entrance to your destiny. Your resilience is the only asset no one can ever steal.